Welcome to We Are Ivy. Um, we've been talking about, over the last number of sessions, a couple of major shifts that have happened in churches, and one of them has been a shift from internal to external. That is, churches need to be thinking and acting and planning more about things that are outside of themselves than inside of themselves. And it's not an easy thing to do for churches. A second shift is from being program development focused to people development focus. And again, it's not an easy shift to do that. Most of us have been in church for a while, and we're very comfortable and very used to church programs. And sometimes we get kind of into the streams of those programs, and it's easy to forget that the whole purpose is to develop people. And before long, we just start maintaining programs. So we've talked about those a bit. Today, I want to start a conversation about a third shift. And this is a shift that is in the area of leadership, which I would say over the last 20 or plus years has been the leading topic among church leaders and churches, and trying to get a handle on what leadership looks like, how leadership is effective, what are the skill sets that go with it, and all of those type of things. And in this session, or in the next several times that we meet together, I'm going to be talking about shifting the idea of leadership from what is a church-based approach or mentality to a kingdom of God-based mentality. And when it comes to serving in churches, leaders of all, not just pastors, but leaders of many different kinds of things, this is probably the most challenging of shifts to make, primarily because we have become so used to the current cultural either business or government model of leadership that flourishes in the Western world, at least in the United States. So, going to just mention some of these. Thought it'd be interesting for you to kind of hear in groups of pastors when they were asked the question of shifting their leadership style or their understanding and mode of leadership from being church-based to kingdom-focused. Here were the primary fears. One, I don't know my role in the new world. In other words, pastors are saying if we shift from a church-oriented leadership to a kingdom-oriented leadership, I'm not sure what my role would be in that. I feel comfortable in the church. I know the church. I know how the church functions. I know how churches operate. But what leaders are saying is they feel less certain and less comfortable in a model that is kingdom-shaped or kingdom-focused. And here's one. This is probably the most honest one, and it is the one that, given the pandemic, is the one that over the last number of weeks I have heard myself in a number of meetings, a number of groups from a good number of pastors. I don't know how to make a living in the new world. And that is a very real and present fear in a number of pastors. They have become used to functioning and operating in a church-based environment. Their income, our income, comes through that. And to shift the terms of leadership or the thinking of leadership to kingdom-based or kingdom-focused leadership does raise the very honest question of how do pastors who have made a living in church-based leadership, how do they make a living in kingdom-focused leadership? Here's another one from pastors, their fears. I don't know if I have the right competencies and skills to function in a kingdom-oriented world. They feel like they have the skills and competencies to function in a church world, but those skills do not necessarily translate into a kingdom of God-oriented world. Other fears. I don't think that I can lead through the transition. It's not so much in this case that pastors don't recognize or realize that the world has changed so drastically, or that institutionalized religion is caving in, and missional Christianity is gaining traction. The issue is not so much that pastors don't get that or have a sense that that is happening. The issue is, or the fear rather, is that we have not, pastors who've been in theological environments and who've been in churches for a good number of years, have not been trained, or oftentimes do not have the experience of going through the transition. They know that the transition has to be endured. You have to get through it, but are not sure. Pastors, many of them, are not sure if they can lead through it, if they can survive it, if they can bring their own personal life and family intact through it. It's a pressure cooker for ministry leaders as well as it is for churches. And a lot of pastors have fears about being able, again, to provide for their families, to maintain their employment, to be able to move from one world to the next. And quite honestly, in most cases, it is easier just to stay in the world in which we are, or which many pastors find themselves in, and just see how much time that can buy. So these are fears. A last one is, I don't know how to get started. These are pastors who have a fairly clear vision that the transition needs to happen, but are not sure how you start, and what do you do? There's no magic answer or silver bullet to getting these kinds of things off the ground. So there are very legitimate fears, and recognize that these are fears that are not only highly prevalent among pastors. These are fears that all of us in churches experience. And so, how do we deal with this? Let me list some of the things that are typically associated with church-based leadership, so that we can draw a contrast between that and kingdom-based leadership. In the typical church-based leadership model, a lot of the stuff that happens in churches and a lot of the things that leaders do are rooted way, way back in the time of Constantine. Now, I've mentioned him a number of weeks ago. I know it's hard to keep all these things. Constantine was an emperor, and a Roman emperor, and he tried to Christianize the world because he could see that the Roman Empire was crumbling, and he was thinking of ways, how can I unite people? And he came up with the actually grand idea from a political perspective that he could take Christianity and let that be the unifying force of an empire. So he sought to do that. Well, in doing that, over time, as you could possibly imagine, the church began to take on some of the form and some of the flavor of other institutions, like government. And so a lot of current church leadership modeling is actually based not in a very grounded or founded biblical and theological understanding of leadership, but in a model of leadership that is rooted all the way back to the 4th century in Constantine. As a result of Constantine, all of these other things kind of flow out of it. As time went on, the church culture typically was dominated by the clergy. There were hierarchies of clergy, and as you know, the hierarchy kind of led to ultimately the one person, one position kind of model of leadership. And in that day, it ultimately resulted in the Pope as that one person or that leader. I know in our Protestant traditions, we don't use words like we have a Pope, but the reality is we have synonyms that we often use. And the idea is the same, that there is a particular church hierarchy, and at the top of that hierarchy, in many models, is the lead pastor or the senior pastor. But the idea, whether it's a pope or a senior pastor who thinks in those terms of hierarchy, the idea is exactly the same in either case. And this idea of church-based leadership has also led to what is often called maintenance ministry. In other words, there are certain things that churches do. There are certain expectations that come along with being associated with the church or being a leader in the church. And basically, the idea is just to maintain a certain church culture or to maintain a certain style of leadership. Leadership in this model was also positional in the sense, just like we were just now talking, in the sense of pope, or in some instances phrases like senior lead pastor. Um, Oftentimes that gets translated as leaders have certain positions or they carry certain titles. And once you get kind of swept in to positional type thinking, that if you have a certain position, you have more power or you have more leadership capability. Once that takes hold, it is a very self-perpetuating kind of mindset, and it's a very difficult cycle to break, that somehow being named to or ordained to a certain office that carries a certain title comes with a certain power or authority that goes with that title or with that position. Church-based leadership is also very church-focused. You have to, oftentimes what it comes down to is you have to keep as many people happy as possible. And you usually can't say these words out loud, but oftentimes the more people that a leader or a pastor can keep happy, the more smooth the sail is through those waters. So there's always this incredible temptation to serve at not so much the pleasure of the people, but the pleasing of the people. Serve to please. And when people are happy, as a leader, as a pastor, your calling is typically more happy with that. And finally, the church model tends to be hierarchical. We've already talked about this, but it ultimately boils down to who has control. And the higher up the hierarchy you go, the more control individuals have. Now, that's been a standard approach to church leadership for a very, very, very long time. And a kingdom-focused approach to leadership takes most of everything I just named and flips it on its head. And that's why kingdom-focused leadership is so different than church-focused leadership. And so let me just provide several things that would be identified along with kingdom-based leadership. Kingdom-based leadership is far more organic. That simply means it's more fluid. It can read a situation. It can adapt more quickly without going through a lot of the barriers or a lot of the hoops or a lot of the motions that you often have to go through in a church-based or in an institutionally driven environment. A kingdom-focused mindset allows a church, not just the leaders of it, but allows the entire church to be more adaptive to what is happening in real time, in the real world. Another mark of kingdom-based leadership is that you have to be willing to be disruptive. And that is one of the most difficult things to do. And it is the one that usually creates the greatest pain in the lives of people. It is the one area in which leaders, ministries, or pastors' jobs might be lost. And that is when you create a point of disruption. That's unsettling. It's unsettling because things that we were familiar with are no longer perhaps the best things to help us to create a future. Things that we knew quite well perhaps are no longer the things that will serve us as well as we're moving forward. And we all get how painful disruption is. It's like having to perhaps, take your family and move them to a place where nobody knows anybody, and you're starting over, and the kids are starting new places in school or new jobs and all of those. Those disruptions in life are hard. And what has happened is that most of us throughout the course of life and in our culture face maybe a handful of major disruptive events, and we want our churches to be places where there is no disruption. I mean, it's just normal. We just want a place that where everything else is changing, we can go to and know, wow, nothing changes here. The expectation is always the same. We do what we do, and you don't have to worry about a major disruption. Well, kingdom-based leaders and kingdom-thinking churches realize that disruption is just a part of what's going to happen. As always, Jesus is our model. Think about how disruptive Jesus was. I mean, here's some guys out fishing on the lake, and Jesus says, "Come, follow me. I'll make you fishers of men," talking about a huge disruption. The way that people challenged, or the way that Jesus challenged people to live Jesus kind of lives, that's a disruption. I mean, the very fact that we use words right out of the Bible like born again, that's a disruption. We had one kind of life, and then we meet Christ. There's a transformation process that begins. That's a disruption. The bottom line is that following Jesus is a disruption. And being followers of Jesus in his church has disruptive edges and moments to it. The very place where we want predictability, the very place where we want security, the very place where we want to be able to come and say, I don't have to worry about being disrupted here. This is my church. This is my home. Quite honestly, is the very place that, from a kingdom perspective, disruption is or should be embraced. I don't know, that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing for all of us. But that's part of what it means to be part of a kingdom-based. It also means that churches are prophetic. And this is not in the sense of churches are able to predict things that other institutions can't predict. It's not about predicting anything. In the Bible, being prophetic is not revealing the future. It is revealing the present of God in today's world, the presence of God. It is forth-telling, pardon me, in the sense that we, the people of God, are telling forth. We are sharing forward what this kingdom is all about and what kingdom life is. And we talk about this kingdom, we share this message in the context of a culture that, it just, doesn't it? It's just unraveling. And if ever there was a time for the church to be prophetic, to share forth what God is doing and who God is, now is certainly such a time. Another mark of the kingdom-based church is that it is empowering. Rather than the structure, the hierarchy of the church-based model, the kingdom-based model doesn't seek to have a hierarchy of power where if you have a certain position, you have a certain power. If you have a certain title, you have more power or privilege or say in something. In fact, it seeks to turn that upside down. What is so beautifully empowering about the church is not the hierarchy. It is the fact that every person is a minister of the gospel. And the purpose of the leadership is to equip and empower those who follow Christ in a church. And so it's not a gathering. Leaders are not people in kingdom-focused churches that are seeking to gather power. They are seeking to give it away in the sense of empowering other people to do ministry. I mean, what a huge, huge difference that is. A difference, by the way, that is often not understood at all. And the final mark that I will mention is that rather than leading an institution in a kingdom-focused church, leaders are leading a movement of God's Spirit in our world, a movement that is focused on Christ and not maintaining an institution, a movement that can flow into the streets or flow into the community or flow into a school. And it's a really different thing to be a leader in a movement as opposed to being a leader in an institution. And we're going to be having conversations about this, but this is pretty challenging stuff because it's new ground. It's for most of us, it's new thinking. It's a repositioning of our understanding of leadership. And it is really hard for any of us to be honest about the leadership models that we have been most experienced with, the ones that we have basically adopted from the culture around us, from business, or from other things in our world, and we just brought them over to the church and we dropped them right into the church and said, if this is what leadership looks like outside of the church, and this is where life flourishes, and this is where we see successful leadership. We've made the grand fault the church in general has of dragging that vision and that model of leadership over to the church and says, if this is what works in the world, this is what would work in the church. Jesus overturns that whole way of thinking that we're so used to. And so I'm going to just invite you to embrace the challenge. Is it hard to rethink? Is it hard to let go of some things so that we can embrace new things? It is for all of us. It is for me. Is it challenging? Is it disruptive? It is. Does it mean that we all have to learn together? It does. Does it mean that we have experts on hand? It does not. Does it mean that it's a high walk of sacrifice? It is. Taking up the cross. And so I look forward to conversations in which we're having face to face, in which we can just, take these kind of things. And wouldn't it be cool over dinner and a good evening together to be able to unpack them, to talk about them, to place our hearts, to evaluate, to pray, to share, to explore, and to hear what God is saying together. So we'll continue the conversation, and until I see you next time, may God bless you, and we will be with you soon.